Welcome, everyone, to the Mentium Matters podcast, where we talk about leadership, life, and the transformative power of mentoring. I'm Megan Cummings Kruger, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking with Peter Ray, a biopharma strategy and operations executive. Now, this is a conversation I've been looking forward to. Peter and I share a uniquely long history. In fact, 17 years ago, when I first began my career at Mentium, Peter was my very first mentor interview. With his authenticity, intelligence, and really intentional focus on others, he made an excellent introduction for me to the caliber of mentors that I was going to be fortunate to work with in our Mentium community. I think it would be fair to say that part of our longstanding connection is due to a shared passion of reading and learning. We've certainly shared a number of great books over the years. And I think that's certainly going to be part of what the listeners appreciate during today's discussion, hearing Peter's thoughtful perspective on holistic learning, thinking strategically, and the power of the pause. So before we begin our conversation, I do want to share some of Peter's background with you. Peter is a life sciences executive and proven leader of multiple member teams, who provides a unique perspective on the R&D productivity and sustainability challenges facing biopharma companies at different stages of their evolution. Currently the head of portfolio analytics at Novartis, he brings deep knowledge of the enterprise capabilities needed to transform strategic vision into measurable reality. Prior to joining Novartis, he held the role of VP, head of strategy and portfolio analytics, and chief of staff to the CEO at Nilayim Pharmaceuticals. There, he worked closely with the C-suite leadership team, the board of directors, to help shape the corporate strategy and long-range plans for the organization. Previous to that, Peter worked at Celgene Corp as executive director, corporate strategy, as well as at Bristol Myers Squibb as VP R&D, strategic and operational portfolio management. Peter is fluent in Japanese and has extensive international and cross-cultural experience. He received his MBA from Stanford University and his BA in Government East Asian Studies from Harvard University. He serves on the board of the Society of Decision Professionals, where he is a certified fellow, and previously served on the board of the nonprofit ARC Mercer. Peter currently resides with his wife outside of Boston and is the proud father of two. And as I mentioned at the start, he's a longtime partner to Mentium. He is currently mentoring his 13th Mentium mentee, along with all the other mentoring that he does. Well, that was a mouthful. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Megan. You make me feel very old.
No. Seasoned and experienced and wise. Now, one of the things as we were discussing this podcast, you shared that one of your roles exposed you to the concept of strategic decisions, and it provided a different way of thinking about the quality of decisions. So essentially, the decisions should not be judged necessarily by their outcome. And at the time, you spoke about how impactful that this shift in perspective was for you, both professionally and personally. So I'm wondering, would you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I first learned about, I think we call it decision analysis or decision quality during my MBA summer internship way back in the day. And I was working with a small consulting company called the Strategic Decisions Group, SDG. They were sort of pioneers in applying these principles to industry. And it's a fascinating framework that melds together both the soft side of things like organizational behavior and natural cognitive biases with the hard side of quantitative analysis. And that juxtaposition really grabbed me. I just love seeing how these things come together and to help us as human beings make better decisions. Now, there are several elements that go into making quality decisions, strategic and other, but at the core is what you pointed out, this concept that you have to judge the quality of a decision not by its outcome, but by how you make decisions itself in the absence of having a crystal ball. We can't predict the future, so we're stuck as human beings doing the best we can with what we have. But there are ways to think about it in a more structured way. This was kind of mind-blowing to me as an MBA, where you're learning about smart objective setting and the like, but it became intuitively compelling. Now, professionally, It was transformative in that, number one, it kind of moved me into a brand new industry. I never thought I'd be a decision scientist working in the biopharma industry, and I've been applying these, principles ever since, helping organizations make better, high risk, high return decisions in the face of uncertainty. Personally, it started me on a journey to reevaluate what success really means to me and how to achieve it. I mean, some of the core elements of decision quality, one of them is values. What do you really care about? How do you define success? I learned through the years that I hadn't really given that much thought, to be honest. And then alternatives is another key component of decision quality, and learning there's more than one path to achieve success. And some are better than others, but they can all be compelling and good. And last thing is like framing. What can I control now? What can I influence now versus what should I worry about later? It's easy to get wrapped up about a lot of minutia and details, but miss the forest for the trees. And so it just in many ways, both professionally and personally, it was very transformative time of my life.
Well, and we're going to hear this theme throughout our conversation of the power of the pause. And that's my hook, not Peter's. But one of the things I really appreciated, early on, you became fascinated with this. You are such a learner. And then you've had years now of using the decision-making tool, thinking strategically. And one of the things you were just talking about is really sounds to me like pausing and taking that step back as you are making these decisions and following a process, such as how important values are. And at a time when it has been, I don't know if there's ever been a faster pace than we're all facing right now. I'd love to hear, just for the benefit of our listeners, some, if there's an example that comes to mind as far as, providing people with a little more tangible example of how do you use this?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what we're talking about is going slow to go fast. And I think there's a tendency of, if you try to make decisions too quickly with incomplete information, you end up regretting that, have to retrace your steps and go back and start over again. That actually slows you down in the long run. I think at a professional level, we've had lots of examples in work where, I think in drug development, for example, most of the companies I work with are in that space. This is very tricky, trying to mesh the bench science of discovering new molecules and learning more about human biology, and then trying to say, I think there's a drug that can actually fix that human ailment. And you have to go through lots of different steps along the way to prove that hypothesis correct, to see if you have a drug or not. It's too often the case in our industry where we will sort of go down this one single path without exploring other options, only to find out halfway down the road, whoops, we took a wrong turn somewhere. We have to go back and do it again. And that just delays the entire process and can be very costly. I think in my own life, it's become such a part of me now that I can't like point to a particular episode per se, but it's really about not rushing to judgment in many ways, and to sort of take that step back to say, okay, I have an intuition here, but what am I missing?
Mm-hmm.
And what other information, what other perspectives can actually enrich the path forward, the set of choices that we have before us.
You're in your 13th year cross company mentoring.
Yeah.
You mentor wherever you go. What have you found when you've mentored your mentees that has been a helpful learning or guidance when it comes to thinking strategically and being decisive, making decisions?
I think what that starts to evoke for me is there's a tendency, I think, especially if you're well educated, if you're an expert, a specialist in your field, that you must have the answers. You must know the answers. That's the expectation. I'm a certified fellow of the Society of Decision Professionals. That must mean I know how to make decisions. Well, guess what? I'm just as human as anybody else. And I think, in the field we may call it expert bias, but even in the mentoring relationship, sometimes my mentees will come and approach me with, I got a challenge. I've got this issue I'm dealing with. There's a natural human tendency to say, okay, I've seen that before. I know what to do in that case, or this is how I've handled that in the past. But quite often I have found that I'm working with incomplete information. I'm missing major important pieces of that puzzle. And so if I don't take the time out and just stop myself to say, well, tell me more. What's actually going on in that case? What actually did your manager say, or that other counterpart that you're struggling with right now? And have you, what do you think might be going on in their mind right now? What do you think they might be wrestling with themselves? Have you approached it from that point of view? And it's through that further exploration and this sort of back and forth dialogue. Number one, I realized, yeah, I had that wrong the first time around. I was assuming some things that weren't indeed correct. But then in terms of finding solutions, it sometimes becomes self-evident. And it's like, I don't even, I'm not the one who's like finding the solution. The mentee, him or herself, they're realizing it's like, yeah, actually, now that you mentioned that, now that I think about it that way, maybe I could try this. And so this is, I think, a part about going slow to go fast, which is taking that step back and not rushing to judgment can really get to a better, more effective decision strategy, call it what you will.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So, expanding on thinking about learning that has come for you over time and experience and your love of absorbing knowledge, I'd also like to ask you now on a topic of communicating effectively. This is another, making decisions, communicating. And I do want to layer this with the recognition that your life experience actually does include a wealth of both global and cross-cultural experience. And those, of course, are layers of complexity. So that's a mouthful to ask you, but I'd love to hear, what are some of the learnings that you've found helpful?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And it makes me think a little bit of, I think Plato attributes it to Socrates that a wise man knows he knows nothing, or that the equivalent thereof. When I was growing up, I think I had a tendency to talk a lot. I felt silence was a bit awkward, and so I would, and plus with supposedly being a high achiever, there's a natural tendency, oh, I need to show my smarts and my intelligence. Oh, I have a perspective on anything. And then all of a sudden I spent a fair amount of time in Japan, particularly my junior year in college. And I lived with a host family that spoke no English, or if they did, they intentionally hid that from me. And it was one of the best years of my life because I was sort of, you know, imagine having your hands tied behind your back. You have all these thoughts in your head you're trying to communicate, and yet you're still learning the language. And furthermore, what you hear around you every day in the house, outside, and it's all foreign language. And it really forces you to try to slow down and take the time to listen first, to say, am I understanding what they're saying? No, I'm not. Let me ask lots of questions to make sure I'm actually getting what they're asking me or saying to me, and then I can try to gather my thoughts in response. A great lesson for someone who likes to talk a lot. And I think that's sort of carried with me, and I still sometimes struggle with that tendency to, say, oh, I know the answer, let me tell you what it is. But taking that time to ask more questions and to, and truly seek to understand, I think it's a crucial skill that we all need to develop, professionally and personally. I'm also reminded of when after I proposed to my wife, who happens to be Japanese as well. We met in Japan, and we went to her parents, and I was speaking with her father, who also didn't speak English. And it was sort of like asking for permission, forgiveness, not permission, because we'd already agreed to get that. My wife and I had already decided to do it. And what he said to me has stuck with me to this day. He says, Peter, I'm, I'm not worried about you being an American, about you taking my daughter overseas, and all that. My only concern is communication. And he says, it's not the language I'm talking about, because your Japanese is pretty good. It's truly being able to, she's coming from a different culture, different upbringing, and, will you two be able to overcome, because marriage is a long time, all the years of different choices and conflicts and debates and arguments, and still come through that. And that's the one thing that, my hope for both of you is that you can figure that out. And he's so right. For any of you who have partners and relationships, I mean, that's the core of it. And I think that extends not just to personal life like that, but even in a business environment. How well can we connect with others? Because at the end of the day, in most careers, most people that we interact with, we're working as part of an organization with other people. And how we get on the same page and cross-fertilize different ideas and perspectives and mindsets for the common good, it all comes down to how we interact with each other in that way. So, it truly, and that's where it's not just about asking questions with the idea that you want to score points in a debate. That sometimes happens too, I think sometimes, where really we're trying to win an argument somehow because we think our idea is the right one. It's really shifting that mindset to say, no, this isn't a debate where we're trying to win an argument, win or lose. It's about getting to a common understanding of something, getting to an aligned point of view. And that requires us to sort of take the perspective of we're on the same side of the table, we're having a conversation looking at the same problem together. She's got some ideas, I've got some ideas. How do we get them all on the table and then learn from each other and then put those together in the most effective way? That's to me such an important part of truly communicating that sometimes we can lose sight of.
Yeah. It's such an important value. And first off, your father-in-law, so wise. But it is, I'm just thinking as I'm listening to you, how you've kind of had within your own home life, like the master's experience of communicating across culture. And, for example, different cultures, obviously in the States here, it's more kind of right, wrong, and more a little more combative in our legal system, for example. Whereas there's some cultures that, no decision is made until everyone agrees. So as I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking about how you've really kind of lived that. And I'm guessing that really has had an impact in your professional life.
Oh, 100%. And you're spot on. I mean, you reminded me of my time at Mitsubishi Corporation. I was in Tokyo. That's where I met my wife. And that is very much a consensus society. And speaking of the books, you reminded me there was a book called The Cultural Map. I highly recommend it if you're interested about it. It's a wonderful exposition on different cultures and how we work together. But back to Japan, my time there, I was struck by how they call it nemawashi, where junior staff would work together, come up with some kind of proposal, recommendation, solution, but they'd have to work at like sort of like a spiral going up the ranks and getting everybody to agree to it and sign off on it. And then it would eventually get to the final decision maker. And the main, question that the final decision maker was asking is, has everybody agreed with this? And assuming that that was the case, the chances were pretty good. They'd be like, okay, then let's go ahead and do it. Very different from Western business culture and so forth. It's got its own drawbacks, but it's still very, that sort of, seeking to understand and trying to get alignment is, I've tried to carry that with me to this day. There's also an element here of, having both humility and openness to see other points of view, and then the vulnerability and confidence to admit you don't have all the answers. And I think that's also been something I've been trying to take away. And I lead an organization right now. I've been in my field for a long time, so in some ways I think, okay, I'm kind of an expert in this space. But I'm now working for a European company. I have colleagues in Switzerland. I have colleagues here in Cambridge. Some are in Dublin. They come from all different, European background, Taiwanese, Chinese, Portuguese, Irish, and it's fascinating because they're seeing the same issues through a slightly different lens, and what they think are the important elements are sometimes a little bit different from how I see it. And that's helpful to me. That's immensely useful to sort of challenge my own thinking and expand, the possible set of options we have before us. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah.
And that's it, but you really need to sort of remind yourself that yes, you're the boss, but you don't need to have all the answers. It's okay.
Well, and again, in listening to you, I've been fortunate enough to have some learnings around culture, nothing like the level of experience you've had. But it's always impressed me how different that perspective can be and how important it is to understand things. I had a friend come back. She'd lived in Germany for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And what she shared with me was that here in the States, if somebody asks you something, we typically will say yes, but then start backing away. First we're just all, whereas in Germany, and again, we're talking tendencies, but in Germany, the natural reaction is no. But if you understand, that's just a starting point, and they may back into yes, is such a turnaround in understanding.
Right. That's a wonderful example. And it's also what I've noticed is even when we're speaking, English together, we're learning English in different cultures and different environments. And that shows in that perfect example where, no can mean yes, yes can mean no. It all depends on the context. And it's not a language thing per se, but another sort of interesting cultural thing in India. So I have Indian background. My father was from India. I have some Indian colleagues too on my team. I failed to mention that. But there is a head shake that is actually an agreement. That's actually a yes. But in sort of more Western culture, we tend to look at that and say, oh, they're saying no, they're disagreeing. And it took me a while to figure out, wait, what you're saying doesn't match your body language. And they're like, yes, it does. And I'm like, oh, I see. Now I get it. But that there's a richness to that too that I find so wonderful. And it's another reason why I love the mentoring opportunity so much is each time with different people with different backgrounds, you see the world through different eyes. But it's also it's so important to have that curiosity and have that empathy where you take joy in learning about how other people see the world and see the problems that you're both dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, there is. That's exactly the word that comes to my mind. Is there's such a richness in the diversity of thought wherever the diversity goes or comes from, and that does allow much more out of the box thinking and creative thinking. And you were just touching on talking about being a mentor, which leads me into my next question. As I mentioned at the top, you have mentored. This will be your 13th year doing cross company mentoring with us, and of course, wherever you are, you're mentoring internally as well. And something we talked about in preparing for this podcast is how much respect you have and experience around how holistic learning is. Mentoring is very holistic. And you talked at the time, and you mentioned already a couple of it. And I've always loved, I think curiosity is getting finally its moment in the sun. I think people are finally, there's so much that comes with that. And it's a very easy thing to lose, particularly if we're stressed, we're busy. The other one that is absolutely being reappreciated is empathy. And I would add, and we talked about this before, so much of that can come with the power of the pause. So I'm wondering, does any story come to mind as far as a learning experience you had that maybe surprised you or it was interesting and you could have either been the mentee or the mentor?
Yeah, I think I tend to fixate a little bit on my failures in that regard. I think back to early on in my career when I was at BMS, my first full industry job in pharma. And there was one colleague in a different part of the organization where we would go through multiple rounds of having the same conversation over and over again. And it was just extraordinarily frustrating for me. And I was like, why can't this person get it? And I think finally some folks kind of sort of took me aside and said, in his space, in his domain, there the concept of uncertainty is antithetical to what they are trying to do. And it's whether or not he's sort of getting the concepts, he's trying to interpret what you're saying through his own frame, his own lens, and it's not matching what his order is. And you kind of need to think about that, and not get frustrated by it. And this was sort of before I started figuring out about, okay, this isn't an adversarial debate where we're trying to score points. If we're both trying to accomplish a common goal, let me switch to his side of the table and try and see it through his point of view. It's taken me a lot of years to get better at that. But that was sort of one example of that.
I was going to say, I love that example. It's interesting. My husband and I, neither of us ever did debate, but our oldest daughter did at the state level. And when we went to state to watch, I was blown away and a little resentful that we don't all get that kind of training where you go in the way they did it where she was. You walk in, you don't know which side you're going to take. And then later, you're going to have to take the opposite side. And the learning that comes from that and the flexibility of the mindset is just incredible. But the other piece that I really liked about what you were talking about, that empathy piece, some of our listeners, certainly if they've been in the Menteam community for a while, one of the assessments that we love the most is the communication style assessment, the HRDQ assessment. And I remember when I learned all this information, it was early days at Menteam, and I'd never, ever been exposed to it. And actually, as I talk to people, professionals these days, many people have never done a communication style assessment. Lots of great assessments out there that are amazing, but not as specific. But what I remember is understanding level of assertiveness, level of expressiveness, 4 general buckets, the amount of empathy that I gained for the other styles. I literally remember thinking, oh, they're not working for my personal destruction.
Yeah.
They're not trying to make me crazy. This is just how they're wired. And then that empathy puts you in such a better place, right?
It does. It absolutely does. And I think there's always two parts of communication, speaker, listener. I think we all have this need for self-awareness about what is our own style, what are our own tendencies. And I, I think, what I have kind of experienced through the years is that we rarely spend enough time thinking about that first and foremost before we even learn about other people. The other people out there we see on a daily basis, and so we form our judgments, and it's like, oh, I don't like the way they talk, or this person I really get along with, this person I don't. But rarely have we taken the time to either take an assessment like you just described to say, well, what's my style, and what are my tendencies, and how am I being perceived? Just to share one other anecdote, one piece of feedback I will never forget for the rest of my life. One of my teammates, and again, another BMS story, but I was maybe like 5 years, 6 years into my role as a leader of a team. And so I had a fair amount of experience, and I thought I was pretty good at it, but I tend to have a somewhat intense style sometimes. I get very passionate. So I like to call it passionate. Others might call it a little bit intense. But what he shared with me is, Peter, the thing you need to be aware of is when you get frustrated, it comes across, it very much shows, and it really intimidates people, and we know where it's coming from. We're on your team, we know you behind the scenes, and we really respect you. But it would be helpful for yourself if, rather than sort of expressing frustration, anger, you turn that into disappointment. And just reframing your own style as to one of like, oh, it's unfortunate we weren't able to do this. I'm a little bit disappointed that this came out this way. That completely changes the way people react to you. I'm like, oh my gosh, that one piece of advice, it's kind of eye-opening, quite the game changer. But then if you pair that self-awareness and sort of the gift of that kind of feedback, if people are willing to give that to you, with then we'll extend that same courtesy to those that you're communicating with, and whether it's about assuming positive intent or reminding yourself that they're acting rationally in their own mind based on their own style, their own circumstances, and they're not out to get you or anything. It's just that's who and how they are. So let's bridge that. Let's be aware of how we might be coming across to them, and let's truly seek to understand, I'm not getting something. I'm not understanding something here important. That's on me. How do I tease that out? How do I get to a better understanding of why somehow we're not connecting on this point? And don't blame it on them for not being able to communicate. Blame it on yourself by not being able to perceive and hear it correctly. So that's something I try to take away.
First off, I love that reframe, and it's a great example. I can't remember if I've shared it with you, but one of them, we I at least pick up mantras and put them down. Wherever I am in life, there's a certain one. Lately, the mantra that's been primary for me is similar to what you were saying, which is be curious, not furious.
Oh, I love that.
Isn't that, I mean, it's
That's
like a,
excellent.
right? It's just my foothold and it's my quick, easy mantra because that's absolutely it. The reframe is so powerful. And I love that example, by the way, because it is amazing the gift of feedback. We don't know until we either ask it or are given the gift of feedback truly how we are coming across. I can't remember, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, but he has this great thing about communication where he says, the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it took place, that you think you communicated perfectly, but it does not
Oh,
matter if the other person didn't hear it.
yeah.
And so that really struck me. The other
Yeah.
thing I'll say, this apparently, the listeners need to understand, Peter and I cannot talk without just I do kind of a nerd dump. But we have not talked about the book, The Four Agreements, but I'm guessing you've read it.
No, I have not read that one yet,
Oh, you
actually.
would
Yeah.
love it.
Okay.
Listeners, you would love it. The Four Agreements, it's very, very old. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. Toltec wisdom. I think it's an old culture in Mexico. It's an amazing book. In fact, I read it every few years again. But one of the four, and these are values and they're not easy, but one of the ones that hit me the hardest when I read it the first time, and it continues to be my biggest challenge, is take nothing personally. And
Mm.
that's what you were talking about. I mean, I guess we're human, but
Yeah.
at its essence, as you were saying, this has to do with the other person's wiring and they've had a bad day, whatever it is, there's such a power in figuring out ways to not take it personally, right? To keep that empathy.
Yes. Yes. That's brilliant. That completely resonates with me. And it's hard. It's not easy to do. I mean, especially in the heat of the moment. But this also, I think, connects back to your point about the pause and just taking the time, even forcing yourself to take the time if need be, to just take a step back and process for a little bit. And actually, now that reminds me, it connects me to, we're talking about books again, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I mean, this is such a wonderful one that talks about our system one, system two thinking. And, most of our lives we're going through system one and we have our intuition, we have our heuristics, we're making the decisions in the moment, in the fly. And we have to really force ourselves to move into system two and say, no, let me process and think about this a little bit. But that is such a critical element to create that space and to just stop and think for a moment, and then challenge yourself quietly. It's like, okay, what am I missing here? What else could be going on? And how might I learn more? How can I figure that out? That all connects.
Yeah, it does. So part of what, comes from being open, being curious, and you've talked about this, is being curious about the path ahead and not necessarily following a straight line. And I'd love to hear more about your experience with that.
Yeah, so career planning, it's always been a bit of a mystery to me personally, because as I reflect back on my career, what strikes me, and your listeners may have picked up on it in my own resume, there was no master plan, to be honest. It was sort of, it may look from the outside in hindsight as some kind of like linear progression, but it absolutely was not. And I started thinking I was going to be a diplomat. And so in college, undergrad, that was what I was studying for. And all of a sudden, senior year, Mitsubishi Corp came. Well, so first of all, State Department came. They were sort of trying to drum up candidates to join the State Department, and they basically said it's a tough job because all the prime ambassadorships go to the appointees, not to the career diplomats. I'm like, okay, thank you for that candor. That took me a different direction. I went to join Mitsubishi Corp, a Japanese trading company. And 8 years between New York and Tokyo, I was going back and following that path. And it was a wonderful experience, two different international assignments, a lot of growth. Most importantly, I met my wife. But I knew that wasn't going to be where I wanted to go long term. I go to business school, and that's what often people do when they want to make a career change but don't know what yet. I went into consulting because I couldn't decide yet, and consulting is a great way to try to figure that out. And then, as I mentioned at the top of our little discussion here, that was transformative. It got me into life sciences industry, into this space of being a decision scientist and in biopharma, helping us make, these big challenging decisions. But that wasn't planned. And it really was a consequence of a door opens. And there are a couple doors. I mean, any time in our lives, it's not like we have like a plethora of choices that are real in front of us. We have a few that we can go through if we're lucky, and we pick one and we go that route. And that'll take us to one destination and one set of experiences. And from there, we might at some point in time get a few more. Sometimes we do execute those, other times we just let those fall by the wayside, continue on the path that we are. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I remember being interviewed and sometimes getting the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I couldn't tell you. I have no idea, but I hope I'm having fun. And I think this is such an important thing that as I look back now, and I share this with my mentees as well, it's so critically important, first and foremost, to think about, well, what is it that makes you happy? What do you find enjoyable in any kind of occupation, career, calling? And you may have a hunch, you may think you know what it is. Well, then try that out. But also be honest with yourself to realize you may actually be wrong about that. You may think you find something interesting and enjoyable, only to find out when you get inside, it's like, it's not what I thought it was going to be. It's okay. You can, and then use that experience to pivot. Every step along the way, it should be, if you're doing it well, it will be a learning experience. For better, for worse, you learn from it and you can just continue follow the doors as they lead you from one path to the next. And, people often say it's not the destination, it's the journey. I kind of attribute that to careers as well. It's, as one more aside on that, one struggle I had earlier on, I would say, and I've had some conversations with mentees about this too, is especially when we're younger, it's in Western society in particular, we have this expectation that you have to reach a certain level. We're going to be president of the United States. We're going to be CEO of a company. We're going to be top of the pyramid, if only we try hard enough. I still recall it was like probably like about 10 years ago not even that, maybe more like 5 years ago, when I finally realized I don't want to be the CEO. I'm quite happy sort of being a contributor to something. Yes, I can lead if I need to. I don't mind that. But that particular position in an organization is actually not something that I aspire to be. And it took me a while to figure that out. This is part about like learning who you are yourself and what truly motivates you, and not blindly following some cultural expectation of what you should be doing and what you should be achieving. And
Mhm.
if you can do that, then all of a sudden you start to look around you and realize there's a lot more optionality in front of you than you think. And even within organizations, sometimes, I've had some chats with folks like, gee, there's a chance to stay, if I stay in this role, I can continue to be promoted, and become like an expert in my field. Or there's this other role on the side that would be more of a lateral, or it might even be a step down from my current level. Should I do it or not? It's like, is it interesting? Would you learn from it? Would you enjoy that role? And there's value in expanding your knowledge of what is out there, not to mention your own personal skill set. And from that, you'll find more doors, more windows, more options to choose from. And you may be surprised where you end up at the end of the day. But if you approach it consciously, deliberately in that manner, and stay open to opportunity, you can have a wonderful journey.
I completely agree. And what you hit on right at the end there, was what I was thinking is you were open, but you were intentional. It was an evolution. You didn't have a rigid linear 5-year plan. You wanted to learn, you wanted to stretch, and you were intentional where you headed. But it doesn't, and again, just like with communication styles, for some people that's the gold standard, is having these long plans. But I think it's such an important message to hear. It's also okay if you don't. And I will tell you, talking with mentees all of these years, and this has been pretty consistent, out of all the things that they'd like to focus on, and they're so varied. But one of the most common in their year in the mentoring program is actually career planning. And they're always surprised to hear that they're not the only one. And I remind them they're put into this program. It's an honor, it's recognition that they're great and hardworking. It also means, when was the last time, as we were talking about, they paused, they took a step back, they looked where they were and what they wanted. And I think the final such important part of what you were saying is, remember, what do you enjoy? That's what I adore about the Strength Finders tool, is that it finally had people understand. And again, it gets down to brain research, that what you love to do is where your energy and your motivation lies. So it's such a win-win. But a lot of times we don't pause to think about that question you posed to your mentees. Well, do you enjoy it? Will you learn? Yeah. Such a good point. All right. This next question is really kind of a catch-all. We've talked about so much, but I always like to give an opportunity to share what comes to mind from this conversation. All your years of mentoring others, any advice we haven't touched on as far as up and coming leaders? I mean, the cliche to me is always, what do you know now that you wish you'd known then? So for the newer mentees and the newer employees, the younger generation, what would you like to share?
Yeah, I think the first thing is probably that realization we just talked about, which is there's more than one path, and there's no single right one. They can all be equally rewarding. Just, stay open to it. In fact, the fastest path to happiness and success is rarely the most direct. It probably has a bunch of detours and, little side trips, and those tend to be the most memorable, and the most pleasantly surprising. So stay open, stay flexible in that regard, but based on, as you said, the intentionality of spending some time thinking about what it is that actually energizes you, what motivates you, beyond just a title or a sense of accomplishment or a salary. What gets you up in the morning, and just, you approach it with a smile, as opposed to gotta, and I'm going back in and gotta deal with that issue again. It's like, so that, taking that time, that intentionality, and that staying open to other challenges, I think is a big one. And, back to this point about pausing, again, we're bringing up things like, these mottos like, take time out to smell the roses and whatnot. But, it's, if you're so focused on what you have yet to accomplish, you'll miss the joy and satisfaction of what you've already achieved. And I think that was, I had to have some folks point that out to me in some of my darker days, when things weren't going as well for my career. And both my wife and other, colleagues, that my own mentors, were saying, Peter, look at everything you already have done. It's, this is a minor setback. It's a new opportunity for you. It's just, all it is this door is closing, another one will open. But appreciate what you've already accomplished along the way. That to me is sort of, the biggest thing, along with, everything else we've talked about so far. And we've touched on this a little bit, but when I talk about that self-reflection, I think there is a particular element that took me a long time, which was, we talk about being authentic, right? Well, that applies to yourself as well. And that's often the most devious, the most challenging, because I think we all grow up with certain expectations, whether it's from our parents, from society, from culture around us, that success is defined a certain way, or we need to be this person or accomplish that goal. But rarely, when we're young, are we self-aware enough, or should I say confident enough, to push back on that and say, no, but hold on a second, that's not really me. I'm on this track to become a lawyer. It really doesn't excite me. In fact, it's a drag. And I look back and it's like, I love music. I did do some performing arts when I was growing up. So part of me wished I had done a little bit more of that, when I was younger, and that I had given it a try to, join a band and do something like that, do something crazy. Traveling around the world. I love to travel. I wish I had taken a gap year. That wasn't a thing back when we were growing up, I think, but take that gap year and just explore the world a little bit before getting on the hamster wheel. I really think that would be sort of, if I look back on, if I could tell myself or tell other folks who are just starting their journey, it is to be honest with yourself, and let that be your guide.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. And what's fascinating as I was thinking about this is because I'm always thinking in the world of mentoring, but often I talk to mentees and I tell them, so often you're hard on yourself. The mentor is going to hold up a mirror and it's going to be much more positive than you think. And that is true for a lot of external experiences. But I think what you talk about, which can be challenging but rewarding, is that honesty as far as the self-awareness and that internal peace and the confidence. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, last question. And that is, do you have a favorite quote or motto? I love having people share.
It's funny. You and I have talked about that quite a bit, and I've often tried to come up with something, and I was saying to my wife Maki today, the honest truth is I don't have a particular one. I enjoy lots of different quotes.
Yeah.
When I hear them, that's like curious, not furious. Oh, I love that. That's fantastic, right? But my mind, unfortunately, it's not very detail oriented, so I tend to forget things. But some we've shared, Socrates, the two of them. So a wise man knows he knows nothing. That's always sort of resonated with me. Know thyself, another one from Socrates or Delphi or whatnot. But if you make it a little more fun, I don't even know where this comes from, but you do you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like a little bit, it's kind of what we've been talking about all along, but in a little more sort of lighthearted, informal way. I think it really carries a lot of weight, about
Yeah.
yourself. And I'll just tack on the good old fashioned golden rule, which is like, there should be some constraints on that too, and it's like, there's lots of different quotes that we could point to. I don't have a single one that I gotta abide by or have on my wall, but yeah, it's a good amalgamation of different concepts, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you were talking about the quotes early on. It's just always interesting hearing, what really sticks and resonates with people. I actually think that you do you. How much is communicated in those three words, two of which are repetitive?
Right. Right. But to do yourself, you kind of need to know thyself first, right? So this is why it's hard to be, you do yourself if you haven't taken that time yet.
Yeah.
But you can explore, and one thing we didn't talk about, risk taking,
Yeah.
and I think this is yet one more element about the nonlinear path, right? Which is, I think, particularly with folks who are early on, even mid-career, before life becomes more complicated with families and bills and mortgages and everything else, having that courage and the faith to say, this is the time where I can take a risk. I can try to start that company up. I can be entrepreneurial. I can take that challenge role. It's so easy to find reasons why you shouldn't. Challenge yourself and be open to finding a reason why you should. I think that's yet another piece I would say to the old me. Maybe I could have taken a few more of those along the way, but.
Well, that's such a good point. And I think courage is the word around that. And when my husband's sister was graduating college, McNeil and Lair, I don't know if you remember them on PBS, Lair was the speaker, and he had a heart attack 6 months earlier that he survived. So when it was the most entertaining, fascinating, interesting graduation speech I've ever seen. But what always stuck with me is he said to these college graduates, there are three things you need to do: risk, risk, risk. Stuck with me. And shortly thereafter, my husband started a company. So,
oh, there you go.
This has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your insights. I really appreciate how open you are with your experiences and your challenges, which of course is where most of the learning lies.
Yeah.
Because I think it's so helpful for all of us to really, really understand you can be as successful and have a resume 2 pages long. That doesn't mean there haven't been challenges along the way. And I certainly don't think there's ever been a time when the reminder to pause, take a step back and see where we are, to your point, who we are and where we want to be and how we want to get there. It's just never been more useful to have that power of the pause right now. So really, really well-timed reminder and conversation. So thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. I've always enjoyed the conversations, Megan.
Absolutely. I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining this Mentium Matters podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with friends and colleagues. And if you're interested in additional resources, you can find our show notes on the Mentium website. We look forward to having you join us for our next inspiring conversation.